Did you kill them?
No comments.
Police got called there to a disturbance and found your mum, brother and sister dead. Explain to me what happened.
No comments.
Did you kill your mum, brother and sister?
No comments.
Is it your shotgun?
No comments.
Is that a shotgun that was used to kill your mum and your brother and sister?
No comments.
I mean, I can confirm that this knife was taken from you by police officers, okay?
No comments.
Why did you have that knife in your pocket?
No comments.
It's obviously covered in blood. Whose blood is that?
No comments.
Have you stabbed someone with that knife?
No comments.
When police got there and found your mum, your brother and your sister, on your mum, or right next to her, is a book called How to Kill Your Family. Have you ever seen a book with a cover like that at your home address?
No comments.
Did it belong to you?
No comments.
Or did it belong to someone else living there?
No comments.
Have you ever touched that book? Because it was found right next to your mum.
No comments.
Was it just a coincidence that your mum fell where that book was?
No comments.
Have you read that book?
No comments.
Book with that title was right next to your mum. Has it got any significance?
No comments.
Have you been planning how to kill your family?
No comments.
Did you get any tips from that book?
No.
Welcome to Shocking True Crime. Thanks to all our viewers and subscribers for your support. Stay with us for daily updates on the most shocking true crime stories. Don't forget to subscribe.
September 13th, 2022. 2:17 a.m. A quiet street in the heart of Luton, Bedfordshire. The night held the stillness of sleep, interrupted only by the faint hum of a passing car and the echo of a distant siren. Behind the windows of a modest block of flats, nothing appeared unusual. Curtains drawn. Lights out. The kind of silence that belongs to ordinary families at rest. But within those walls, something irreversible had already taken place. The kind of act that would shatter lives, break a community, and leave questions that may never be answered. There were no warnings visible from the outside, no signs to prepare for what lay beyond that locked door. Only silence, heavy and absolute, stretching across the rooms. This was no accident of fate, no twist of chance. This was the beginning of a story that would echo through Britain's headlines and courtroom halls for years to come. A home that should have been a place of safety became the stage for violence few could comprehend. And so we must ask, how does an ordinary family home transform into the site of one of Britain's most disturbing crimes? They were a family that, to the outside world, looked like so many others scattered across the quiet neighborhoods of Luton. Their lives were not extraordinary. Not the kind that made headlines. A mother working long hours, 3 children moving through the blur of school days, sports practice, and the struggles of growing up. To the neighbors who saw them carrying groceries up the stairs or walking together toward the bus stop, the Prosper family seemed ordinary, comfortably invisible. But hidden inside the fabric of this family's story was a fragility no one saw coming, a fracture slowly widening until one day it broke apart in the most devastating way. At the heart of this family stood a woman named Julianna Falcon. She was 48 years old, a mother who had lived enough life to know that nothing came easy and nothing stayed perfect. Julianna had the quiet determination of someone who carried more than her fair share. She worked hard to put food on the table, harder still to keep her children together after the storms that had blown through their lives. Friends and colleagues remembered her as practical, sometimes stern, but fiercely protective. She was the kind of mother who sacrificed her comfort to ensure her children had shoes that fit, uniforms that were clean, and a roof that would not leak. And in a world that often overlooked women like her, Julianna was the invisible pillar that held up everything around her. Her children were her pride. Each one different, each one carrying a piece of her. Kyle, the eldest of the 2 still living at home, was 16. He had the restless energy of a boy balanced on the edge between childhood and manhood. His friends described him as quick with a laugh, always competitive, never wanting to be the one left behind. He loved football, he talked about trying out for bigger teams, and he dreamed of a life that might one day stretch beyond Bedfordshire. School reports painted the picture of a boy who could achieve more if only he focused, if only he believed that the future was really waiting for him. But Kyle had hope, that restless, hungry kind of hope that makes teenagers believe tomorrow will always be better than today. Then there was Giselle. 13 years old, wide-eyed, curious, and tender in ways only the youngest child in a family can be. Teachers called her diligent. Friends called her kind. She had the patience of someone who listened more than she spoke, the gentleness of a girl who still lingered at the edge of innocence. Giselle loved drawing, her sketchbooks filled with imagined faces, half-finished cartoons, and bursts of color that made sense only to her. She was at that delicate age where every day felt like a step into a new version of herself, where dreams were fragile and self-doubt came easily. Yet those who knew her said she carried a quiet determination, the kind of spark that suggested she was ready to bloom if only given the time. Together, Kyle and Giselle had the kind of sibling bond that swung between rivalry and tenderness. They bickered, like most siblings do, about chores, about space, about who got the last say. But they also leaned on each other. On long school days, they would share snacks, complain about homework, laugh at jokes their teachers never understood. In the cramped flat where they lived, their closeness was both a necessity and a gift, an anchor that tethered them when the world outside felt uncertain. To their mother, watching them grow side by side was both exhausting and beautiful, a reminder of what her sacrifices were for. The Prosper family had not always lived in Luton. Years earlier, Julianna had made the decision to move here, seeking stability and opportunity, even if it meant starting over. That choice came after hardship, after failed relationships and financial struggles that nearly broke her. She carried her children through those years with sheer force of will, taking whatever job she could find. Cleaning shifts, retail work, anything that paid enough to keep the lights on. And slowly, painfully, she built a new life in Luton, a life modest in every way, but safe, steady, and anchored by her devotion to the children she raised largely on her own. Neighbors remembered the family's move-in. They remembered the mother's smile, tired but polite, as she introduced herself. They remembered the children, quiet at first, then slowly folding themselves into the rhythm of the community. Over time, the Prospers became familiar faces. Julianna could be seen lugging laundry or grocery bags, Kyle could be heard kicking a football against the wall, and Giselle was the little one with the sketchbook always tucked under her arm. To everyone watching from the outside, there was nothing remarkable about them, and that, in many ways, was the tragedy. Because behind the closed door of that Luton flat, a very different story was waiting to unfold. Life inside the household was not without its challenges. Money was tight, arguments happened, and stress was always near the surface. Julianna worked too many hours, the children often felt the absence of a father figure, and tension sometimes ran high. Yet like countless families across Britain, they made do. They survived the small storms, patched over the cracks, and carried on. The walls of the flat held laughter, too, birthday candles, exam results, silly arguments about TV shows. These were the ordinary textures of a family trying to find their way. And in those ordinary moments, there was love. Imperfect, yes, but love all the same. Looking back, it is almost impossible to reconcile the warmth of those small domestic scenes with what would later unfold. Photos show a mother beaming beside her children, their arms wrapped around each other. School memories recall Kyle and Giselle laughing in hallways, their friends never suspecting that danger was quietly blooming at home. The images are sharp and vivid, a teenage boy full of restless promise, a young girl tracing her future in colored pencil, a mother standing tall despite the weight she carried. These were the snapshots of lives that should have continued, stories that should have been allowed to grow. But they never would. And so the question rises, the one that hovers over every retelling of what happened: what does a mother owe her children, and what do children owe back? Julianna owed them everything she had, and she gave it freely. She gave her years, her health, her joy. She gave her children the one thing she could control, a chance. And yet the balance of that question hangs heavier here, because one of those children would repay that debt not with gratitude, not with love, but with violence so profound it defies understanding. For now, though, the story remains in this chapter, frozen in those moments before the darkness broke through. A mother, exhausted but unwavering. A son, restless but full of possibility. A daughter, gentle and still becoming herself. Together they formed the fragile portrait of a family. Together they filled a small Luton flat with both hardship and hope. To the world beyond their front door, they looked like anyone else. But inside that ordinary home, a storm was gathering, one that would soon shatter everything they had built, leaving only questions that can never truly be answered. On the 12th of September, 2022, the quiet market town of Luton moved at its usual pace. Streets carried the familiar sounds of traffic, footsteps, and children heading to school. But inside the mind of 19-year-old Nicholas Prosper, a plan that had been forming for weeks was now ready to be set in motion. This was the day he would secure the weapon that would change the lives of his family forever. It was the day he turned his dark fantasies into action. Nicholas had been studying the details of firearm access for months. Britain's strict gun laws made it almost impossible for someone like him, young, without experience, without standing in the community, to acquire a shotgun legally. But he was patient. He researched licensing systems, learned the formats of identification cards, and studied the patterns of official documents. By the time September arrived, he had created what investigators would later call a meticulously forged gun license. It looked real enough to pass a brief inspection. The holograms, the seal, even the typed codes mirrored those used by law enforcement. For a teenager with no formal training, it was a frightening display of determination and cunning. That morning, Nicholas walked into a licensed dealer with the calmness of someone who believed he belonged there. He presented the forged paperwork, spoke with quiet authority, and asked for a shotgun. The dealer, unaware of the deception, sold him the firearm and several boxes of cartridges. It was a simple exchange, one of many the shopkeeper had made that month. Yet hidden in that ordinary moment was the beginning of extraordinary violence. A camera above the counter captured his face as he carried the weapon out of the store, expressionless, focused. Forensic teams would later reconstruct the purchase and the hours that followed. Nicholas went home with the shotgun tucked inside a bag, carrying it through streets where no one questioned him. He had already cleared a space in the flat to prepare. Investigators found gloves, wipes, and instructions printed from the internet on cleaning and maintaining a firearm. They discovered notebooks where he had detailed his plan step by step. Every move had been mapped out: when to strike, how to silence the noise, and how to escape without immediate capture.
Welcome to Shocking True Crime. Thanks to all our viewers and subscribers for your support. Stay with us for daily updates on the most shocking true crime stories. Don't forget to subscribe.
What truly disturbed detectives was his online activity that evening. Digital forensics revealed his search history, queries about infamous mass shootings, methods of killing efficiently, and timelines of other tragedies. He had visited message boards where killers were glorified and attacks dissected like case studies. He typed phrases like, "how to cause maximum casualties," and "school shooting lockdown procedures." He was not only interested in killing, he wanted to understand the mechanics of chaos. That chilling window into his thoughts left investigators and prosecutors convinced this was not a crime born out of sudden anger. It was a carefully designed blueprint for destruction. And yet, as midnight approached on the 13th of September, the weapon Nicholas had secured was not carried into a school. Instead, it was turned inward, toward the very family who had given him a home, who had shared meals and birthdays with him, who had no reason to expect that their night would be their last. The flat in Luton was silent when Nicholas raised the shotgun to his mother, Julianna. She was the first target. He pulled the trigger, and the sound shattered the stillness. In the seconds that followed, he placed a book across her legs, a bitter symbol, chosen with deliberate cruelty. The title, "How to Kill Your Family." It was not a coincidence. It was not impulse. It was a message. A declaration that what he had done was not random but chosen, staged, almost theatrical in its cruelty. From there, Nicholas moved toward his younger sister. 13-year-old Giselle had no chance to escape. He shot her with the same weapon, her life cut short without hesitation. There was no hesitation in his steps, no pause to reconsider. It was as though each action had already been rehearsed in his mind, practiced until it felt inevitable. But the most brutal violence was reserved for Kyle. 16 years old, asleep in his room, perhaps stirred awake by the earlier gunshots. Nicholas shot him once, then again, and when the gunfire ended, he reached for a knife. What followed was beyond comprehension, more than 100 stab wounds, inflicted with relentless force. Pathologists would later struggle to explain the sheer brutality of it, calling it overkill, a frenzy that went far beyond the act of killing. Each wound told its own story of rage, obsession, and the need not just to end a life but to annihilate it. Neighbors later described the sounds they thought they heard. A loud crack, then another. Some thought it might be fireworks. Others said it sounded like something heavy falling. But no one knew the truth that night, not until the following day when police would piece the timeline together. The flat remained eerily silent, the walls absorbing the horror within. In reconstructing the crime, investigators traced Nicholas' movements step by step. Footprints marked by blood. Shell casings on the floor. The knife still slick with evidence. Forensic markers revealed a story told without words, a mother ambushed, a sister executed, a brother butchered. And all of it at the hands of someone bound to them by blood. It is here the audience must pause. Because the question is not just what Nicholas did, but why. Why would a son turn on the woman who carried him, on the sister who admired him, on the brother who shared his childhood? What drives a person to see family not as flesh and love, but as obstacles to be erased? This is not the story of strangers in conflict. This is the story of blood turning against blood, of kinship dissolved into carnage. After the killings, Nicholas fled the scene. He carried himself into the night with the coldness of someone who had completed the first stage of a mission. The shotgun was wiped down, placed into hiding with 33 remaining cartridges. He did not run far, but he ran long enough to create the illusion of distance. When he finally stopped, it was not to surrender with guilt, but to control what happened next. Hours later, armed officers from Bedfordshire police would be called to the Prosper flat. They had been alerted after reports of gunfire. Body-worn cameras captured their cautious entry. Flashlights cutting through darkness. Shouts echoing off narrow walls. And then, silence. Silence broken only by the discovery of 3 lifeless bodies. Julianna, Giselle, and Kyle. Their lives extinguished, their future erased, their home transformed into a grave. The footage revealed spent cartridges scattered on the floor, blood pooling where each victim had fallen. Officers described the atmosphere as heavy, suffocating, the air itself carrying the weight of what had just taken place. It was no longer a home. It was a crime scene, frozen in horror. And Nicholas was gone. The chapter of violence had closed, but the questions had only begun. Investigators now knew what had happened, but not yet the full scale of what Nicholas had planned. The night of terror was not intended as the end. It was meant to be the beginning. Nicholas Prosper did not vanish into the night like so many killers who try to cover their tracks. Instead, only hours after leaving the crime scene, he made a move that shocked investigators. He flagged down a passing police car on the streets of Luton. Officers who first saw him thought they were dealing with a concerned civilian, perhaps someone reporting a disturbance or an accident. But the truth of that encounter was far darker. Standing calmly by the roadside, 19-year-old Nicholas began to reveal the outlines of his crime, not with shame or tears, but with a strange detachment, almost as if he were describing something that had happened to someone else. The arresting officers later recalled how unnerving that moment felt. Nicholas pointed them toward the area where he had hidden a loaded shotgun and 33 unused cartridges. He gave instructions with unsettling precision, as if he were proud of how carefully he had concealed them. There was no trembling in his voice, no visible sign of fear. His hands did not shake. His eyes, according to one officer, looked vacant but focused, like someone replaying a mental list rather than experiencing the aftermath of violence. For men trained to deal with criminals of all kinds, this composure was disturbing. It was not what they expected from a teenager who had just massacred his family. What chilled them further were the words that followed. As Nicholas was being restrained, he asked one question over and over again: "Are the schools in lockdown?" His voice did not rise with panic. It was flat, almost curious, as though he were checking on the progress of a plan. To the officers, those words made little sense in the moment. But once investigators pieced together his journals, his online searches, and his full confession, the meaning became horrifyingly clear. Nicholas had not intended for the violence to stop with his mother, his sister, and his brother. In his mind, the murders at home were only the beginning, the opening act in what he imagined would become the biggest massacre of the 21st century. He had written those exact words in his notes. He had studied the history of mass shooters across the world, memorizing their methods, their mistakes, and the legacies they left behind. He believed he could surpass them, that his name would be spoken in the same breath as the worst killers of modern times. It was not enough for him to destroy his family. He wanted to leave a mark that stretched beyond the walls of his flat, beyond his neighborhood, beyond Luton itself. Psychologists who later reviewed the case spoke about this fixation. They described a young man disconnected from empathy, enthralled instead by the mythology of mass murder. To Nicholas, the idea of causing fear was intoxicating. He saw schools not as places of safety and learning, but as stages upon which his fantasy of chaos could play out. This obsession had grown for months, feeding on isolation, feeding on anger, feeding on a belief that infamy was a prize worth killing for. When he asked about lockdowns, it was not concern for children's safety. It was regret that his larger mission had failed to begin. As interrogators pressed him, the full picture of his bigger plan came into view. Nicholas had chosen his former primary school as his next target. He knew the layout. He remembered the entrances and exits, the times of day when classrooms were fullest, the schedules of assemblies. He had calculated how long it would take for police to respond, how much damage he could do before they arrived. In his notes, he had sketched out potential strategies: where to fire first, how to move quickly between corridors, how to maximize casualties before being stopped. For him, the deaths of his family were a trial run. The real performance was meant to follow. The chilling reality is that, had Nicholas not made a crucial mistake, he might have carried out that plan. Investigators later admitted that it was only by chance that his scheme collapsed at stage 1. The forged license had worked. The shotgun had been purchased. The ammunition was in his possession. All that remained was for him to walk into a school filled with children. In his mind, that would have been the day history remembered him, not September 13th, not the night his family was slaughtered, but the day an entire community's children were turned into victims of his hunger for destruction. The horror of this possibility shook detectives, prosecutors, and even seasoned officers who had seen countless acts of violence. They could not escape the thought of what might have been. Classrooms filled with terrified students. Teachers throwing themselves between bullets and children. Parents rushing to barricaded doors, waiting for news. The death toll could have been catastrophic, one of the worst tragedies Britain had ever faced. And all of it nearly came to pass because one teenager had managed to bend the rules just enough to arm himself. During interviews, Nicholas returned again and again to the idea that his family's deaths were merely stage 1. He spoke about it not with sorrow, but with irritation that he had not advanced further. He told officers he wished he had killed more people. He claimed he wanted to be remembered, to be feared, to have his name written in headlines across the world. His words carried no remorse for the lives already taken. Instead, they carried longing, for the massacre that never came, for the destruction that was stolen from him by the accident of his arrest. For those listening to him, it was like staring into a void. How could someone so young be so far removed from the basic ties of love, compassion, and loyalty? How could a son extinguish his own family and still yearn for more blood? The officers who sat across from him described a chilling calm, a teenager who seemed more interested in the mechanics of violence than the humanity of his victims. One detective said it was as though Nicholas saw himself as the main character in a twisted story, one he had written in his head and was desperate to bring to life. The community of Luton, when they learned the details, struggled with disbelief. Parents asked themselves how close they had come to losing their children.
Welcome to Shocking True Crime. Thanks to all our viewers and subscribers for your support. Stay with us for daily updates on the most shocking true crime stories. Don't forget to subscribe.
Teachers lay awake at night, wondering how they could have faced such terror if Nicholas had walked through their gates. Investigators admitted openly, the town had narrowly escaped a tragedy of unimaginable proportions. The Prosper family's murders were horrific enough, but the scale of what Nicholas envisioned would have scarred the nation for decades. And so the question lingers, heavy and haunting, if not for a single miscalculation, how many more headlines would have followed? How many funerals would have filled the weeks that followed? How many lives would have been rewritten in grief, simply because one teenager believed that killing was a path to legacy? Nicholas' capture prevented that future, but it did not erase the horror of what he had already done. It did not bring back Julianna, who had spent her life fighting for her children. It did not restore Kyle, with his restless energy and unfulfilled dreams. It did not save Giselle, whose sketches would never again spill across the pages of a notebook. Their absence remained permanent, even as their killer spoke longingly of the massacre that never came. For those tasked with bringing him to justice, Nicholas Prosper was not just a murderer. He was a warning. A warning about the fragility of systems meant to protect communities. A warning about the dark allure of infamy that festers online. A warning about what can happen when obsession meets opportunity. And in every courtroom session that followed, in every headline that recounted the case, that warning echoed louder than the details themselves, that sometimes the greatest tragedies are not only the lives lost, but the lives almost lost, the futures narrowly spared, the catastrophes barely avoided. When the shock of the murders gave way to the work of justice, investigators in Bedfordshire faced the task of laying bare every detail of Nicholas Prosper's actions. Forensic teams combed through the Prosper flat for days, photographing every shell casing, every bloodstain, every trace of the night of terror. They catalogued the forged gun license that had allowed Nicholas to walk into a shop and buy a shotgun without question. They logged the cache of ammunition he had hidden, 33 cartridges ready to be fired. And in the notebook spread across his room, they found the darker truth, handwritten plans, obsessive sketches, and pages of words that revealed the extent of his ambitions. The journal spoke of death as if it were a game to be won. He wrote about stages and scores, about body counts and headlines. Investigators found internet printouts beside the journals, case studies of school shootings, online articles about security procedures, diagrams of lockdown drills. His laptop told the same story. Search histories revealed nights spent reading about Columbine, Sandy Hook, and Uvalde. His queries were not casual. They were deliberate, methodical, framed like research assignments. One line chilled detectives most. How to be remembered forever. It was there, typed into the search bar, as though the murders themselves were less about destruction and more about carving his name into history. By March 2023, the evidence was complete, and the case moved to Luton Crown Court. The trial opened in a packed courtroom, the public gallery filled with family members, neighbors, and reporters eager to understand how a teenager could carry out such unimaginable violence. The prosecution wasted no time in presenting their narrative. They described Nicholas as a boy who had plotted mass murder, beginning with the people closest to him. They laid out the timeline of his crimes with clinical precision, the forged license, the purchase of the shotgun, the rehearsals in his journals, the execution of his family, and the chilling plan to take his violence into a primary school. The courtroom listened as prosecutors read his own words aloud, lifted from his writings and online searches. The biggest massacre of the 21st century, one page declared. The jurors looked at the teenager in the dock, quiet, almost emotionless, while the words of his fantasies echoed through the chamber. The weight of those words was crushing. Each syllable testified to his obsession with fame through destruction. The prosecution painted him not as a boy who lost control, but as a calculated architect of terror who simply stopped before his full design could unfold. The defense, however, pushed back with their own story. They argued that Nicholas was not a monster but a deeply broken young man. They pointed to his childhood, to struggles with isolation, and to signs of mental instability that had gone unnoticed. They spoke of trauma, of a boy who had slipped through the cracks of social services, of a teenager overwhelmed by thoughts he could not control. Their argument was not one of innocence, but of explanation. They sought to remind the jury that behind the brutality was still a 19-year-old who had once been a child shaped by hardship and perhaps untreated illness. The tension between these two narratives filled the courtroom. On one side, prosecutors described a cold-blooded killer. On the other, defense lawyers described a damaged soul. In the gallery, family members wept quietly, neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and teachers who once knew Nicholas stared forward in disbelief. One neighbor recalled Julianna's kindness, her strength as a single mother. Another spoke of Kyle's laughter on the football pitch. A teacher remembered Giselle's drawings, the little sketches she proudly shared. Each testimony was a knife twisted into the already raw wound of loss, humanizing the victims while underscoring the scale of the tragedy. When the evidence of the crime scene was shown, the silence in the courtroom was absolute. Images of the flat, of the bodies, of the staged book across Julianna's legs, were projected for the jury. The jurors' faces tightened, some looking away. The prosecution emphasized how deliberate it all was, the choice of the book, the sequence of attacks, the ferocity of Kyle's stabbing. These were not the acts of someone momentarily lost to rage, they argued. These were the acts of someone making a statement, each step chosen for impact. Forensic experts took the stand. They explained how the forged license was constructed, why it passed a shopkeeper's eye. They described the shotgun, the blood patterns, the fingerprints on the cartridges. Digital analysts testified about his search history and his communications. Their testimony painted a picture of careful planning and a hunger for attention. It was scientific, clinical, but underneath it was the horror of how close Nicholas had come to carrying out something much worse. The defense countered with psychologists, describing Nicholas' mental state. They spoke of his withdrawal, his obsessive thinking, his disconnection from reality. They pointed to his age, arguing that his brain was still developing, that he lacked full adult judgment. They asked the jury to consider not just what Nicholas had done, but why, and whether a lifetime in prison was the only answer for someone so young. But the jury had heard enough. After days of testimony, after hours of deliberation, they returned their verdict, guilty on all counts. Nicholas Prosper was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 49 years. The courtroom, filled with grief and exhaustion, received the sentence with a mixture of relief and sorrow. Justice had been served, but justice could not bring back Julianna, Kyle, or Giselle. Their absence remained final, a void no sentence could fill. The reflections that followed were heavy. For the family members who survived, the loss was eternal. Julianna's friends spoke of her kindness, now silenced. Kyle's teammates spoke of his promise, now unfulfilled. Giselle's classmates spoke of her innocence, now gone. The community of Luton was left scarred, forever tied to a crime that had shocked the nation. For police officers and investigators, there was pride in stopping Nicholas before his wider plan unfolded, but also an ache at how narrowly disaster had been avoided. The case also raised deeper questions for society. How could a teenager obtain a shotgun with a forged license? How could warning signs of his radicalization and obsession with violence be missed? How do mental health systems fail to catch those teetering on the edge of catastrophe? These questions lingered long after the verdict, uncomfortable but necessary. The Prosper case was not just about one boy's violence. It was about the cracks in the systems meant to keep communities safe. And so, as the documentary draws to a close, the narrative must return to the family whose lives were stolen. Julianna, who worked tirelessly for her children, who should have grown old surrounded by their love. Kyle, who should have found his way from football fields to adulthood, who should have seen his dreams expand beyond Bedfordshire. Giselle, who should have filled more sketchbooks, discovered her talents, and stepped fully into herself. Their futures were taken, their voices silenced. What remains are memories, photographs, and the echo of questions that will never be answered. Nicholas Prosper once said he wanted to make history. In the end, he did, but not in the way he imagined. His name is not remembered as a legend but as a warning, a reminder of what obsession and hatred can destroy. The story closes not with his triumph, but with his defeat, the weight of 3 lives lost pressing against his legacy forever. And in the silence after the sentence, the world is left to reflect. Reflect on the fragility of families. Reflect on the danger of missed signs. Reflect on the responsibility to see, to act, to prevent. Because history is not only written by what happens, but also by what is stopped. And in Luton, in September of 2022, history was almost so much worse.
Welcome to Shocking True Crime. Thanks to all our viewers and subscribers for your support. Stay with us for daily updates on the most shocking true crime stories. Don't forget to subscribe.